Dr. Sam Montano, welcome back to Head on Fire. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So you have been on the show before, but just in case this is listeners' first time being exposed to you, who are you and what it is that what do you do? Oh my gosh, I know how to speak.
So I'm a disaster researcher. I have my PhD in emergency management, and I teach in an undergrad emergency management program in Massachusetts. I do a lot of different disaster research on mostly on the US emergency management system and climate change and how those two intersect with one another. And then I do some policy advocacy work to try and make the way we handle disasters go a bit better than it currently does.
You're also the author of the phenomenal book Disaster-ology, which is a great word.
Yes, it is. Yeah, so Disaster-ology is kind of like part memoir, part research on disasters. So it's good for folks who are looking to learn more about disasters and how our emergency management system works.
And that's kind of what brings us here today, because unfortunately, we are yet again experiencing another cluster of really awful natural disasters that have impacted areas that I know are cherished by both of us. We saw Hurricane Helene tear through parts of Appalachia that are not even a little bit prepared for hurricanes because they don't really get them there, or at least, they didn't before. And Hurricane Milton just, kind of rammed through Florida and some of the coastal areas. But in that space, we're dealing with a political season, we are dealing with an election year, and we are dealing with an uptick in misinformation and disinformation, which is how I tune into places like NPR. Why am I holding a phone? Um, I tune into places like NPR, prestigious news and organization that pretty much just does straight news, and I'm having to hear words like they can control the weather. Like we're dealing with conspiracy theories about the weather, and people are taking it seriously. Like it's not a fringe thing; it's a mainstream political talking point. So I wanted to have you on to kind of have this very timely discussion about misinformation, disinformation, and then maybe clarify what all of these various organizations do. Let's start right there. There's been a problem of misinformation and disinformation. It's gotten so bad that I've seen reports coming out of North Carolina that armed militia are FEMA hunting, or hunting FEMA. How did we get here? And what danger does misinformation in the wake of a natural disaster present?
Yeah, so look, every disaster, there's always misinformation, meaning like incorrect information that gets spread around. And I think the vast majority of the time, what has happened is that somebody hears something, right? It's a disaster, communication is tough. And you play a little game of telephone, you tell your neighbors, like, oh, you have to talk to this person and do this and do that to get help from FEMA, and things just get twisted, right? And so then that spreads. That is something that we're quite used to having happen in emergency management. And, oftentimes during disasters, FEMA will put up like a rumor page where they try to sort through any kind of more persistent rumors. Obviously, that's like the role of the media is to help people sort through that.
I remember
Um,
way back in Katrina, there was some of that about like who qualified for checks, who qualified for
right,
relief. Did you have to be a resident or something? But
right.
what it is now
Yeah.
seems to be very different.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, recovery funding is complicated, so it's not surprising there's confusion. What is happening now is distinctly different from my perspective. So, as you mentioned, you have these like full-on conspiracy theories that are, going. You have like mainstream politicians posting about online, and are getting legs, right? That like hurricanes have been sent to certain parts of the country for like political reasons, which, like, to be clear, is obviously not what's happening here. And then you also have this really scary, from an emergency management perspective, strain of disinformation about FEMA specifically, to the point that, as you mentioned, the Washington Post has reported that FEMA is having to evacuate certain communities themselves because they have received word that there are armed militia, allegedly, I think everything's trying to be confirmed right now, that are threatening to kill FEMA workers based, again, on things that like people like Laura Loomer have been posting online.
So, right up here at the top, what is FEMA?
Sure.
I think a lot. I mean, it's an organization that people don't directly interact with until it's the worst day of their lives, right? So, most of us may not ever interact with FEMA, hopefully.
Yeah, exactly. So most people's knowledge of FEMA, if you haven't directly interacted with them, comes off of what you've heard on the news, right? And you have events like Katrina and the levee failure where FEMA did not perform in an effective way. And so there's kind of always been, or for a long time, has been some frustration, let's say, with FEMA, just because of the way the agency is structured. But the actual purpose of the agency is to help people before, during, and after disasters. So FEMA is responsible for doing mitigation to try and prevent disasters from happening. They prepare us for the disasters we can't prevent. They help with response, and they help with recovery efforts.
They're literally
And
the
they're
Federal Emergency Management Agency.
Yes, yeah, they do it all. And also I should mention, like, for all hazards, like anything bad you can think of, if it reaches the point where local and state government is overwhelmed, then FEMA comes in to kind of back them up.
So, at what point, and I realize that if folks already know about this, this might feel, a little too intro 101, but there's a lot of people that don't know. Uh, at what point does FEMA come in? At what point and how does that process get triggered?
Yeah, so when we have a disaster, the governor of the state, um, if they feel like they are out of resources to help, they will request a presidential disaster declaration, which is opens up funding for that disaster. That declaration has to be approved by the president. FEMA gives their input, but it's the president alone who decides if the declaration is granted. And basically, that is the president directing FEMA to start helping and using federal resources, so from other agencies too. And that can come in the form of individual assistance, which is helping survivors directly. And then the like biggest chunk of money is really going to public assistance, which is paying for things like fixing roads and bridges and helping to get utilities back on, those kinds of things.
So it isn't Joe Biden or whoever's currently in the White House just deciding that the federal government is coming in. They can't go somewhere that they are not wanted and asked for.
No, this we live under federalism, so the governor has to ask.
Okay. Um, so a couple other questions about FEMA that have floated around, and I think that a lot of people really want this to become a partisan like gotcha. Um, is it true that Republicans voted against funding FEMA 2 weeks before these disasters happened?
Kind of. So
Yeah, I was going to
FEMA,
say I looked into that and it seemed like quite a lot of nuance was there. So,
yeah, there's a lot of nuance here. So we can try to sort through this. So the biggest pool of money that we have, or FEMA has, that's going towards individual assistance and public assistance, is called the Disaster Relief Fund, the DRF. And this is basically America's emergency fund. So when a presidential disaster declaration has been granted, and only then, FEMA is able to access the money in the DRF and start spending. So that like $750 you've been hearing about, that's coming out of the disaster relief fund. Funding for sending in medical teams and search and rescue teams is going to be, they're going to be reimbursed through the DRF. Paying for fixing schools in North Carolina, that's going to come from the DRF, right? And so the DRF, Congress at the start of every year put X billion dollars in there. And usually like 15 billion, 20 billion kind of range, depends on the year. And sometimes that's enough for the year, but more and more that is becoming not enough for the year, right? We start running out of that money. So last fiscal year, FEMA just about ran out of money. They were down to like a billion, 2 billion maybe in there. And that was when the Congress started fighting about the budget, right? And they were like threatening government shutdown, and we went through that whole thing again. So when the disaster relief fund starts getting low, the FEMA administrator, Deanne Criswell, has to make a decision about what they're going to do. They are going to Congress along with the president saying, we need to refill the DRF. You need to give us more money. Congress is saying, no, we're not going to do that. So when that happens, Administrator Criswell has to make a difficult, but I think responsible decision to implement something called immediate needs funding. And what that means is recovery projects across the country stop being funded because they have to start saving what's left in that fund in case we have a disaster and we need it for response for the life-saving measures. So this summer, Deanne implemented immediate needs funding. So recovery had stopped again across the country, which is a huge side problem to deal with. And they were kind of pinching pennies, trying to make sure there was money in there, especially because we're in the middle of hurricane season, right? So the likelihood of us having a big disaster is like pretty high.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that has ended up being what happened. Congress did allow FEMA to add a $20 billion, basically they could start spending their money for this next fiscal year, starting on October 1st. So FEMA has, I think it's about $11 billion in the disaster relief fund right now. But there was reporting from, I think, yesterday that said basically in 14 days, they've spent half of the year's allotted disaster relief funding. So FEMA is going to need more money, right? And they had
Mm-hmm.
asked Congress to give them more money. And so that's where that fighting is coming from. One other, I know this is in the weeds a bit. One other important thing about the budget here, though, is that the Small Business Administration gives out loans to both businesses and individuals after a disaster. This is potentially the biggest pool of money you can kind of get from government. It is a loan, not aid, but still. And they are just about out of money. They're going to run out of money in the matter of days, which means they're going to stop giving recovery funding out to Helene, to Milton, other disasters around the country. So when we say Congress needs to come back into session to pass additional relief funding, it's not just that FEMA needs more money, it's that these other federal agencies who have a role in recovery specifically are literally out of money.
So it isn't just FEMA that
No.
helps in the recovery. Like you were talking about, FEMA helps, get infrastructure back together, helps provide housing and like emergency stuff. But as far as like rebuilding the communities, there's a lot of other moving parts that get involved.
Yeah, exactly right. FEMA is not just responding on their own. They're coordinating other federal agency. Just about every other federal agency at some point is going to be involved, right? Like I mentioned, rebuilding schools. The Department of Education is going to be involved in that, right? You've already seen Pete Buttigieg involved with the rebuilding of roads, and DOT is going to be involved in that, right? So kind of depending on what their expertise is, they're going to be providing resources or expertise or whatnot in the recovery. You also have like all of state and local government who are going to be involved in various ways. You have elements of the private sector and then also the nonprofit sector.
I don't really want to alienate anybody who might be listening to this for information and for clarification. And I realize that saying political words inherently comes with a gut feeling to want to be alienated, but or if you're like, oh, you're attacking me, you're attacking my people. Um, it seems to me that the reason why a certain political party can't get behind or is helping to churn out some of this information is that to fund FEMA, that to support disaster relief would be to at least tacitly admit that climate change is real, which is something they really don't want to do. Is there a way to, I mean, we are seeing areas of the country, Appalachia, here specifically, hit with the kind of storms that they shouldn't be hit with. Historically, they aren't hit with. Um, how has climate change impacted the role of emergency management? And is there a way to talk about these things and talk about the need for funding without using the words climate change so that we aren't alienating people that that are like, no, 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 science bad.
Yeah. Well, look, climate change has affected everything in
Yeah.
emergency management, right? It's this underlying factor that's increasing our risk, which is what emergency management is responsible for dealing with. I am hard pressed at this point to find emergency managers who do not understand that climate change is happening and that we need to do something about it. And in fact, even during the Trump administration, the FEMA directors um, were on record as
Mhm.
talking about climate change, right? Even though his administration was, um, not talking about it or, doing what they were doing. And so, kind of within our field, it's really not quite as controversial as I think it is in other places, just because we're on the front lines of having to manage it. That said, I do think that in emergency management, there has been an argument that maybe we don't need to point out how connected climate change is to every single disaster that happens in an effort to try and leave at least some of these politics out of it. And I get it. I get the sentiment. However,
Sorry, it makes me angry. That's just
I know.
like why?
However,
Like I just okay. We
the
we
problem,
politicized a virus, and we're gonna politicize the weather, I guess. So
right, exactly. Like, and here's the thing: regardless of leave climate change out of it, disasters are still political, right? They
sure.
always have been political, and something that I think there needs to be a greater recognition of here is that Republicans, particularly right wing Republicans, do not want the federal government doing disaster relief work, period, whether it's related to climate change or not. They do not think that that is the role of the federal government. They think it should be left to the state, which I know because they wrote about it in Project 2025. But even more moderate Republicans in the past have talked about eliminating FEMA. Mitt Romney infamously said that we should eliminate FEMA in 2012. And then Sandy happened, and he kind of walked that back real quick.
Can I
So,
ask? Because I mean, I
yeah.
remember that he was one of those people. Texas governor, I forget his name, was also one of those people that wanted to eliminate, various. Was there a backup plan?
No, the backup plan is that the states will just take care of it,
Oh, okay.
which
Well,
is
so what happens whenever you have like so some like a state like California has a big budget that they could maybe figure out how to combat. What do you do with a state like, I don't know, Delaware or North Carolina or
I
so
don't know. I genuinely don't. Like, if you go through
okay.
Project 2025, there's no explanation. There really isn't. There's like some vague references
Okay.
to states getting insurance policies that are not rooted in reality.
So we're
There
all paying
really
for
isn't
it
a
at the
solution.
end anyways. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's not. And it also, I think the thing that's really
We're gonna do a
frustrating,
GoFundMe.
yeah, the thing that's like really frustrating here is that the very definition of disaster is that a local jurisdiction is overwhelmed, right?
Mhm.
Like the whole reason that FEMA exists is for these events that are bigger than the capacity of local and state government, right? So to say that, well, we're just not going to be involved or we're only going to be involved when it's truly catastrophic, like Katrina or worse, it's not rooted in any reality of what we know about disasters and about effective emergency management.
Um, I do want to talk about effective emergency management because I remember from our last conversation and from many of the kinds of things that you talk about on your own social media platform that we think of emergency management as what happens afterwards, but you're always thinking about emergency management as what should be happening before the disaster happens. There's a through line here because now we are seeing parts of our country affected by kinds of disasters that they've never really been affected by, at least not in modern history. Again, coming back to Appalachia, how are emergency managers talking about getting ready for the future? I mean, is there a way to kind of how are they doing that? I don't even know that I don't know what the right wording for that question is of like, how do I prepare for any possible thing that could come at me because I'm in a state that I don't think should ever be hit by giant hurricanes, and yet we have states that are being hit by giant hurricanes. So, like my own state, I live here in Illinois. We used to get a lot of blizzards and a lot of really cold, dark, frozen stuff, and now it's flooding.
Mm-hmm.
Now because of climate change, it's a lot of flooding, it's a lot of water, and that's a very different kind of problem. So, how are emergency managers talking about preparing areas for future possibilities whenever we don't actually really know, or do we know that, what kinds of areas might be affected by different kinds of disasters?
Yeah. So this is really where there's this intersection between climate science, the climate movement, and emergency management. So in like climate world, what you're talking about is called climate adaptation, right? That's how are we going to adapt our communities to handle these consequences of climate change, including extreme weather events that we're experiencing. In kind of like emergency management world, this is what we call hazard mitigation and preparedness, and this is what we have been doing for decades, right? Um, Now, doing that mitigation and preparedness is definitely becoming more challenging because of climate change, right? There's more of it to do, and the kinds of mitigation we need to be doing in different places is shifting as those hazards are changing. But this is like completely within the purview of emergency management. I think like one way to think about this here is what can we do in every single community and at an individual level too to try and minimize our risk from climate change and whatever else as much as possible, right? So are you going, if you're on the coast, are you going to be raising your house up? Maybe you're in the market for buying a new house. Are we going to think
Mm.
about where we're going to buy that house? Maybe not right on the river. What are we doing
Maybe
to actually
coastal
try and,
property isn't quite the
yeah,
the big money thing that we thought it
not really,
was.
yeah, not really what you want these days. Like let's minimize as much risk as we possibly can. Frankly, that's going to take a lot of money, right? From the federal government, from state, local. That tends to be kind of an expensive thing to do, although you save money in the end when you do that. The other thing we need to do here is acknowledge that there is some risk that we're not going to minimize. There are some disasters that we're not going to prevent. And we want to be ready for those disasters when they do happen. And so that's why we do preparedness, right? This is more of I'm going to use a sports analogy here, which I barely understand, but the mitigation is more
No,
of the
you don't
off.
know I know what you're talking about. Listen here, Dr. Sam Montano. Girl, I have a wicked, I have a, come on. Like, what are we
Sometimes you
doing
just have to
here?
Tried to talk to me about the Red Sox a couple days ago, and I just like melted down. I have no idea. Um, but mitigation is more like offensive, and preparedness is more defensive. Like, what are we going to do to try and protect ourselves once that disaster is happening? And so, um, we need to be doing a lot more preparedness, right? And again, you do that at the individual level, the community level, and that also is going to cost money. um, so it's I do think it's important to recognize, like, yeah, we're experiencing these consequences of climate change. It's absolutely going to get much worse. But there are things that we could be doing kind of within this emergency management framework to try and minimize that.
Um, there's a lot of misinformation out there, and I think it would be, I don't know, a giant waste of time to go through every single possible thing and have it fact checked with you. I do want to
Mm-hmm.
ask for people who listen to this and then say, okay, you know what? I've got some good information. I have had some things clarified for myself. I now maybe want to go to my aunt, my uncle, my parents, my grandparents, or whatever, and help introduce them to good information so that they're not so, wrapped up in the bad stuff. Um, where do where should we be looking for our information? And how can you tell how can the average layperson who doesn't tune into politics and the news cycle as much as folks like you and I do, how can folks spot bad information?
Yeah, I think it's really important to think about this ahead of a disaster too, right?
Sure.
You really want to have your kind of go-to people in a disaster. I think that here this is a place where also you should be looking towards local media outlets. In disasters, we tend to see that the local outlets have the most kind of nuanced and
Hmm.
accurate information, which is really kind of what you need in these situations. Obviously, local news has been kind of gutted across the country, but there is um, still enough of it left that they kind of go all in when these disasters happen. And I would say that local news sometimes, I think, at least on the surface, tends to be a little bit more disconnected from some of the national political stuff in the way that like a CNN or MSNBC might not be.
Um, are is FEMA funding being used to house?
No.
God, I can't believe I'm asking this horrible question. Is FEMA funding being used to house immigrants? And if so, is that a terrible thing?
Right. Okay. So, first of all, no. Money from the Disaster Relief Fund, as I just explained it, that is not being used under this administration for migrant housing. FEMA was tasked by Congress to help support migrant housing, sheltering, and housing across the country. And with that request from Congress came separate funding, right? So that money that was spent on that, like, yes, FEMA spent that money, but that money was not, they couldn't have taken that money and used it for people in North Carolina, right? Like, that wasn't how Congress appropriated that funding. So that is just simply not happening.
Is someone in the federal government controlling the weather? Is that possible? And is there, sorry, it's just people take this seriously, and I don't want to laugh at the question because I don't want to turn people off of it, but it makes me so angry that this is a real
Yeah.
question that actual journalists are having to ask and answer. Ah, is someone in the federal government able to control the weather? And if so, are they doing it right now to control hurricanes and aim them at more conservative areas of the country to harm conservative voters just in time so that they can't vote in the national election? I think that's the through line, is
That's
what
the
I've
through line.
seen.
Yeah. No, certainly that is not happening. Unequivocally, no.
It if Democrats can control the weather, why can't Republicans? Is that, is it because
Uh,
are they just bad at, do they not know how to operate the clicker? Is, is it,
Now, I will say one thing about the weather conspiracies, right? There's again these conspiracy theories have been around forever, but it's how mainstream they've become. I this is one that I'm going to be watching because I do wonder if this is the next iteration of climate denial. Because there is an interesting juxtaposition here between, yeah, humans are affecting the weather via climate
well, that's the
change,
thing. I mean, every time I
right?
engage with this on
Versus
social media,
there
I
is
have
a
people coming out of the
person.
woodwork to say, well, cloud seeding is real. Well, look at the effects of
Not,
cloud seeding. Well, and the thing is, in all of these conspiracy theories, like the ones that, there's just the tiniest little,
yeah,
just the
right,
nugget, the
yeah,
little bitty nugget of something that somebody read
right.
somewhere and then retweeted and then that ran through a translation and then asked chat gpt to reword and then turned it into some other whole other thing, but there was still a nugget of something in there. So I don't know, some people, well, cloud seeding, look at what happened in Abu Dhabi with cloud seeding.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
obviously we can control hurricanes with our Jewish space
No,
lasers or
I
something.
I fear people do not understand the sheer force and power of hurricanes and how far away we ever would be from influencing them in that way.
So they're not keeping Aurora Monroe locked up in a
No,
room
no,
somewhere to
I
control the
don't
weather.
believe so. Not that
I
I
don't think
know
she
of.
would let them. Actually, speaking of, I don't know how, I don't know, we can't, the measurement of these things. Like we saw one, I think it was a meteorologist, but I don't actually know what his job title was, but talking about that Hurricane Milton, I believe, was reaching the mathematical limit of what a
Mhm.
hurricane could be, which, if I'm understanding that correctly, means that it had absorbed all the possible thermal energy in the area and was at just like max for what it like the whatever a hurricane could possibly be. That was it. It was the biggest, the worstestest of the worst. um however, conveying that to people and getting them to leave and evacuate is always a struggle, because especially when you live in areas where you're told every other week, oh, there's a hurricane, you have to evacuate. Oh, there's a hurricane, you have to evacuate. It's going to be terrible. And then it's not as terrible, so people stay. And then more people stay. Do you think that there is a better way to communicate? Is there, what can we be doing to help people evacuate and communicate the need for evacuation? Are there times when we're overhyping it? Are there times when we are underhyping it? And what policies could we put in place to make it easier for people to evacuate?
Yeah, so this is a really good question, and it's one that's rooted in understanding the difference between the characteristics of a specific hazard, so in this case, Hurricane Milton, and the particular vulnerabilities of where that hurricane is going, right? And it's that interaction between the hazard and those vulnerabilities that's going to actually lead to impact. So with Milton, we saw it reach category 5, right? And like you said, just like meteorologically, just one of the worst kind of hurricanes you can be looking at here. But what is more complex here is understanding, okay, so the wind speeds, it's a 5 now, but when it actually makes landfall, the wind speeds are going to be a little bit less. Storm surge isn't going to be affected. That's still going to be really high. It's really going to matter where this storm surge comes ashore. Is it going to be high tide or low tide? Is it
Hmm.
going to go straight into Tampa Bay, or is it going to go south of Tampa Bay, right? Where the geographic conditions are just different, right? Those things make a huge, huge, huge difference when you go to then look at impacts. And one of the biggest challenges here is, looking at those hurricane tracks hours before landfall, and there still being an uncertainty of just a few miles. But those
Hmm.
few miles meaning the difference between the entire city of Tampa Bay being destroyed or another community, like not to minimize, but you're talking about like huge differences economically and
Millions, thousands, millions,
right, like
hundreds.
right. And so that is a level of complexity that in emergency management and like in meteorology, we're all like familiar with and understand. But explaining that to the public is really difficult, right? Because people want to know, yes, go, don't go, right? You hear cat five and you're like, okay, now I'm going to leave. But if it's a cat four, you're like, maybe I'll stay. And it's like, yeah, but it's like nearly as bad. Like and you could still, you could have Milton, you could have that category five storm if it's out in the middle of the Atlantic and it doesn't, make landfall anywhere. It's not even a disaster. Like we don't care about it. It's none of our business. So it's just that level of complexity. We need to do a better job of figuring out how to communicate this to the public. The category system is one that for a long time many of us have said, is not really effective, and I don't really think we should be using it. We really need to be focused in on what are the impacts going to be where you are, and then helping people make decisions from there. The other thing I'll say about evacuation that came up a lot for me during Milton is that there has tended to be, I think, this kind of perception of evacuation as meaning you are like in your car for 30 hours, sitting in traffic, leaving the state. And that's not necessarily what you need to do, right? Sometimes if your house is right on the ocean, sometimes it means you just need to go 10 blocks inland and go stay at a shelter for the
Well, that's
night.
kind of what you
And
were just talking about. It could be a difference of miles. It could be,
right,
okay, I'm in this town, Chicago is going to be hit, but maybe I go out to the suburbs for the weekend kind of
right,
thing. Yeah.
exactly. And and look, it's really hard for people to make those decisions, right? And in retrospect, it's always so much easier to say, oh, I didn't need to leave the state. I could have just gone to the next town over. But before, you're limited by the information you have, how you understand that information, and then, of course, obviously, what resources you have to be able to take action.
One of the other kind of nuances, niche things that comes up when people talk about evacuation is the emotional toll that it takes to try to figure out how much of your family you can take. And for some people, that includes pets. Um, Evacuation decisions often can come down to, can I take my dog with me? Can I take my beloved pet of 10 years? Can I take them with me? We saw somebody chain a dog up outside and to await his fate in a hurricane. That dog was thankfully rescued. But why is there such a problem with hotels and other shelter places taking pets? Is that something that is ever discussed as far as emergency management policy? I mean, don't people think that they would be more likely to evacuate if they could take their dog with them?
Yeah, so this is one of the big findings of the evacuation research following Katrina. One of the major factors of people not evacuating was not being able to take their pets with them. This is a very well known issue in emergency management. And in fact, after Katrina, Congress passed a law called the Pets Act, which focused on this issue of pets in evacuations. So, Florida specifically, if you look at their list of shelters that they had opened during Milton, they designate certain shelters as being pet friendly. They also have like special shelters for like if you have a lot of medical needs. So even like more nuance within the sheltering side of things too as well. So in Florida, there were open shelters where people could go and stay and take their pets with them. It's not
This is
necessarily
the first
every
time hearing
single
of that.
shelter. Yeah,
Like
so
that seems to be on the hush
this is the
hush.
problem. Yeah. This is the problem. I think people don't know about this. And I don't totally know why. Like every tweet I saw coming from Florida State Emergency Management was like, you can bring your pet, like these are the shelters you can bring pets to. I think part of what's happened is in the past that wasn't the case, right? And so people got really used to being like, well, people can't evacuate because they don't have cars, they don't have money, and they have their pets with them. And absolutely, there are like situations where those things are going to prevent somebody from evacuate. but it's also less often the case these days, I think, in most places. But specifically Florida, right? Like there are places for you to bring your pets. Florida also has a number of different programs where if you need to evacuate and you don't have the resources to, there are phone numbers you can call. There are like free Uber credits you can use. There are city funded shuttles that are going to come pick you up, take you to a shelter. And again, that those resources don't necessarily always align with the exact needs somebody has. So I'm not saying that this is like end all be all solution, but many or some states have gotten more advanced at trying to address those challenges and try to meet more people where they're at. We still have a lot more work to do on that in emergency management, but I do think that kind of the rest of us have taken those very valid reasons and that research and almost used that as an excuse instead of saying, well, wait a minute, now let's go find those resources, right?
Hmm.
Instead of just posting and saying people can't evacuate because they don't have money, it's if you don't have money to evacuate, here's the list of resources you can go to try
Hmm.
and get the money to evacuate.
I've seen the only time that I've seen the discussion of pet safe places to evacuate to come up is the discussion that hotels, motels are not compelled to allow pets in a disaster. Um, are there enough shelters to take the people with pets? Because it feels, I mean, I know about shelters in a blizzard here in Chicago and how overrun they get and
Mm-hmm.
how people are left out. Um, are, if everybody with a dog showed up at a pet-friendly shelter, would there be enough places for people with dogs? I feel like the answer to that is an obvious no. So, is there discussion to compel places that people can sleep and stay with their pets?
Yeah, I'm not, that is something that would vary state to state. I am not sure of any state that compels hotels to allow pets during a disaster. There may be, I'm unfamiliar.
Yeah, I haven't seen it either. I just
But
know that that
yeah,
is the context of the chatter that I've seen when it comes to pets, disaster, evacuation.
yeah, part of the issue here too is that people don't want to stay at shelters, right? Which
Sure.
on the one hand, I get, right? There's valid reasons for that. I will say also, however, when we look at the research, the people who do stay at shelters tend to report that they have a good experience there, that their needs are met, that it's not as bad as they thought it was going to be. So I do think, and historically, we have seen relatively few people stay at shelters during disasters. Most people go stay with friends or family, and then secondarily at the hotels. I do think that as these events become more frequent, that there is potentially an argument here for trying to get people to stay at shelters more and try to change the culture around shelters, which would, of course, need to come with an increased capacity at shelters. Um, but again, all of this like out of state evacuations, right? It's
Hmm.
just not necessary, right? I think there's ways to kind of scale our responses back a little bit to make them more manageable, but still protect people. What I'll say here is doing that requires a lot more nuance. And it's
Hmm.
going to require a greater investment just in terms of like staff and personnel in emergency management agencies to start trying to figure out how to do that. Because shifting culture on how we handle hurricane response is like not an easy task.
So some of the other chatter that I've seen is always it's very, very unkind and it always seems to be in the wake. And of course it's ratcheted up during an election year where a lot of people are tying, well, Republicans voted against FEMA relief, and Florida's very deeply conservative right now, and da 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 da, and you deserve it, and ha ha ha. Um, this whole, if you don't evacuate, you deserve. Why would you even live in a place where all of these hurricanes are? kind of vibe that I'm seeing in social media, which is awful. I'd like to state unequivocally. Um, I think that a couple of things can be addressed out of that. I think that there can be a couple of different learning opportunities there. One, people are still going to live in Texas and Louisiana and Alabama and Georgia and Florida. Like going to continue. They're going to live in the Carolinas. They're going to live along the coast. People live along the coast, and that is not going to change. We're not going to suddenly take hundreds of millions of people and shove them inside and create barren lands just because a few months out of the year we have awful, awful, awful storms. That's never going to happen. How do the people that live in these areas prepare for the next one? How do you become educated? What kinds of things do people need to know? What kinds of things do people need to be looking for as far as housing, resources, figuring out those kinds of shelters? And also, for the rest of us that think that we live in such safe areas, like, I don't know, the mountains of one of the Carolinas, because that's just so far inland, that think it's never going to happen to us, but it is probably going to happen to us at some point because of climate change, some kind of natural disaster. What can we start doing now? So, what do the people that live in those areas need to start doing, start learning, start preparing? And what do the rest of us need to be doing?
Yeah, I honestly think it's kind of the same list, right? So there's been a lot of conversation about climate havens following what happened in Western North
There isn't one.
Carolina. There
There's
isn't,
no
right? They
state
don't
that's free of
exist.
it.
And a real like failure to communicate climate risk here, right? So these climate havens don't exist. So what that means is that no matter where you live, whether you
There's
live in
something.
coastal Louisiana or you live in Duluth, you need to look around and see what risk you face, right? And no, you're not going to necessarily face the same amount of risk, but every single place in this country and around the world is at risk of some kind of disaster.
Do you want
So,
hurricanes? Do you want blizzards? Do you want
right.
tornadoes? Do you want fires? Like wherever you
And
live, there's
that
something.
Right. And that is part of it, right? If you are somebody who's willing and able to move related to climate change, really what you're moving to is which hazard you're willing to
Hmm.
put up with, right?
Hmm.
Um, so this all starts with understanding what your risk is wherever you live, and understanding how that risk is changing. That is something that for some communities is easier to like come by that information than others. A good starting place is your local emergency management agency. They are supposed to put together risk assessments that cover all of the different hazards that can affect your community. So that's a good starting point. You also, it's really a good idea to start becoming engaged in your local government. There are so many decisions about emergency management that are made at the local level that you actually maybe have a lot more influence over, as opposed to like something happening in Congress. So, going to your city council meetings when they have them about disaster related issues, being engaged with how those decisions are being made, looking at who's running for mayor, not just who believes in climate change, but who's willing to fund your emergency management agency. And then the other thing is building, community organizing kind of networks at the local level pre-disaster. We know that, strong social networks are one of the things that help communities through response and
I
recovery.
remember from our last interview that you told me
Uh-huh.
that of all of the survival skills that a person could have, what would make somebody more likely to survive the apocalypse? And it was being a social person, being likable, being like ingratiated in the community. And I'm like,
Uh-huh.
well, gosh, I'm really kind of glad about that. I'm glad to hear about that. I can
It's
tell a good
true.
joke. Ha ha.
It's it's true. But this is one thing that I think is hasn't necessarily been talked about a little bit in local media, but in Asheville specifically,
Mm.
Asheville is known for having like these community organizations and stronger kind of social networks and whatnot, as opposed to some other communities, right? And I think you saw that play out in the response in Asheville immediately. And again, I don't know, like the news coverage of this situation was kind of weird just because of the misinformation. But in those communities where you have those really strong social networks, you do see that it helps kind of progress the response along a bit more quickly.
I do want to be respectful of your time. We are coming up. We've got a few more minutes here. So I do want to go through. FEMA has compiled a list of some of like the biggest rumors that are going around. So maybe we could do a quick
Mhm.
true false. If you feel like there needs to be a little bit of context, maybe give it. But I just want to rapid fire go through some of these because there's a lot of mess out there. And some people
Sure.
may be tuning into this, and this may be the first time they've heard that some of this is false. So I
Yeah.
want to try to get to as much of this as possible. Rumor: FEMA is preventing residents and companies from removing debris in hurricane affected areas. True or false?
False.
Yeah, they say FEMA is not blocking or preventing any aspect of debris removal. That is all handled by local governments. FEMA is, it's not doing, that's not FEMA. Rumor: FEMA controls or manages transfer stations, dump sites, and contracts related to storm debris.
False.
Yeah, they don't do that. That is also state, local, tribal governments. FEMA will automatically provide $1,200 if you have been without power for 24 hours.
False.
Yeah, they say this is a misleading statement. Your application will be reviewed, you'll be updated, but no, there's nothing automatic about it. There is some assistance there, though. Rumor: FEMA will only, this is a big one, FEMA will only provide $750 to survivors to support their recovery.
False. Let me add something to this one. Part of the reason the $750 thing went viral, if you will, this time is because this is the first major rollout of this serious needs funding, which is what the $750 is. It's meant to be for like critical needs, right? So like food and water and clothes and replacing
This is,
baby
I left my
formula,
house with
medication,
nothing,
that
I
kind of
have
thing.
nothing,
Yeah.
and I need to take care of
Right.
stuff.
And FEMA used to give a little bit of money out in some events like this, but it was only earlier this year that they like created this specific program and raised it to $750. So this was the first big event that this was done with. And so I think I'm hopeful that in future events, maybe people will be more used to this
Uh,
resource and there won't be as much confusion.
I'll add a couple of extra notes from FEMA's website. This is a type of assistance that you may be approved for soon after you apply, called serious needs assistance, like you said. It is an upfront, flexible payment to help cover essential items like food, water, baby formula, breastfeeding supplies, medication, and other emergency supplies. I do want to note here, it is not a loan. A lot of people are saying it's a loan. You're going to have to pay
Right.
it back.
No.
It is not. And this does not, if you accept this, this does not disqualify you from receiving other types of assistance.
Correct.
Rumor: FEMA is blockading people in Florida and preventing evacuations.
No. False.
Yeah, apparently that was it's a big one in the west coast of Florida and the Florida Peninsula. People are saying that FEMA is preventing them from evacuating. That is not remotely true. They, once again, do not control evacuations. That is state and local government. FEMA only provides loans to disaster survivors.
Only provides loans to
Yeah,
survivors
rumor:
as
FEMA
opposed to
only provides
businesses.
loans to disaster survivors.
True.
Oh, this
As
they
opposed
say
to
this is
who?
false. In most cases, FEMA grants do not have to be paid back. There are some less common
Oh,
situations
oh,
in
oh,
which you
sorry.
may
Yeah.
have to pay
Okay.
FEMA back if you receive duplicate benefits from insurance or a grant from another source.
Yeah.
Rumor.
Well, yeah, let me clarify this. So
Yeah.
through the individual assistance program through FEMA, right? That's just straight aid. The where loans is coming in here is mostly from the Small Business Administration, and there's a lot of confusion between what's FEMA and what's SBA. Yeah.
This is one rumor: applying multiple times for disaster assistance will speed up the process of being approved.
No.
Well, yeah. Okay, this is another one because this does get into some of the stuff that I didn't want to talk about up front, even though I feel like people are going to ask about it. Um, Restricting airspace for Helene rescue and recovery operations. The rumor is that the FAA is restricting access to the airspace.
No,
No,
like
but I
kind of
do want to
no,
add to
right?
that because a lot
Yeah,
of people are also talking about why aren't the various presidential candidates coming in?
yeah,
Why don't you want a president or a
yeah.
presidential candidate coming in the middle of a disaster or at the beginning of a disaster?
So airspace is really limited, especially in Western North Carolina, where you have this terrain where you really need to be up in the air to be doing a lot of these rescues, and you have rural areas that you need to bring supplies to. So, a lot of the confusion here is that you can't just fly around. You have to be checking in with the FAA. That's true always. It's especially true during a disaster. And the FAA will prioritize certain flights, right? Like search and rescue is going to be prioritized over some random person bringing in food and water, right? And that is the responsible thing to do there. Similarly, when a president comes to visit in the midst of a disaster, that shuts everything down, right? You need all of your, law enforcement agencies have to stop helping. Your, local resources all have to go to safely having the president land. If they're just doing flyovers, that can shut down airspace, so that can bring search and rescue to a halt. So the general consensus is in emergency management is that presidents, vice presidents, other major figures need to wait until after the life-saving mission has kind of ended. Start of recovery, that's when you can have them come in and it's less disruptive.
Yeah. This is another one that I've seen go around rumor. FEMA is in the process of confiscating Helene survivor property. If I apply for disaster assistance and my land is deemed unlivable, my property will be seized.
No.
Yeah. FEMA cannot seize your property or land. Applying for disaster assistance does not grant FEMA or the federal government authority or ownership of your property or land. When you apply for disaster assistance, a FEMA inspector may be sent to verify the damage on your home. This is one of many factors reviewed to determine what kind of disaster assistance you may be eligible for. If the results of the inspection deem your home uninhabitable, that information is only used to determine the amount of FEMA assistance you may receive to make your home safe, sanitary, and functional. I don't know where they got out that they were taking people's homes. Um, I think the rest of these are just kind of shades of they are not confiscating donations to survivors as well. Again, kind of shades of some of these other things. But um, is there anything that we didn't cover that you just, if people are tuning into this, and this might possibly be, God forbid, I don't want to be your news source, but if this is the first time they're hearing some of this, what is something, if we didn't cover it or you want to highlight before we go?
Yeah, I would just say that, as is always true on the internet, you have to be extra careful about the sources that you're following. You have to be extra careful, especially in a disaster, to double check the accuracy of what is being said before you share a post. If you see a post and it really is just sounds outrageous, there's a good chance that it's not true. Sometimes it is, but most of the time it's probably not going to be true. And I do think that in the same way after a disaster that we think of like sharing resources to donate or going to volunteer as ways that we can help disaster survivors, I think we also need to recognize that practicing good information sharing during a disaster is also a way that we can be helping disaster survivors.
The only thing that I ever want to add, and you deal with a lot of scams and stuff inside of emergency management. I deal with scams and stuff in the financial world, fraud investigator. The only thing that I ever want to remind people is that there's a lot of folks out there that give a lot of they give good fake sad story on the internet.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people who will start throwing around GoFundMe links and they'll get incorporated into other things and stuff. Just make sure before you're giving your money to somebody, because that can be very well meaning, make sure that before you're giving your money to somebody that, especially if it's like a GoFundMe, that maybe you have some kind of direct connection to these people or you know somebody that knows these people or something like that. But there's a lot of folks that are willing to prey on the goodwill of strangers in a disaster. Nobody's ever found a disaster where they didn't try to make a buck. So be very vigilant about who you're giving your money to. Sam Montano, thank you so much for being here. If folks want to follow you on social media and get your book, where can they do that?
Yeah, so I am at Sam L. Montano on most social media sites. And you can go check out my website, disaster-ology.com. There's links to the book and everything else that I'm up to on there.
And if you happen to be listening to this on the day this releases, which is tomorrow, October 15th, this is a very fast turnaround for a show. You can actually still win a copy of Dr. Sam
Nice.
Montano's book, Disaster-ology. I have a list of resources in my Instagram bio for Hurricane Helene relief for Appalachian communities. If there's a post on my Instagram, if you find it, you can win a copy of my new book, any other young adult book from my publisher, as well as Dr. Sam's book. So thank you so much for that. Thanks so much for being here. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having me.